My name is Charlotte Morgan, and am 32 years old. When my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, my father and brother disappeared from our lives within weeks. They claimed they couldn't handle the emotional burden. I stayed, holding her hand until her final breath. At the funeral they attended for appearances, I was handed Mom's letter revealing that my father had stolen millions from her family business. Their smug faces turned to horror when I announced I was the new CEO. They never saw what was coming next. Before I dive into the most painful and triumphant chapter of my life, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever dealt with family betrayal. Trust me, you'll want to see how this story unfolds. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Westlake, Connecticut, our family appeared picture-perfect from the outside. My mother, Grace Morgan, had inherited her family's pharmaceutical distribution company, but chose a less visible role to raise her children. My father, Richard Morgan, leveraged his marriage into a position as chief financial officer despite his mediocre business school credentials. My younger brother, Tyler, was 7 years my junior, and from his birth became the center of my parents' universe, particularly my father's. The Morgan name will continue through him. Dad would proudly announce at family gatherings, completely ignoring that I carried the same surname. I was always the responsible one. While Tyler wrecked his first car at 16, promptly replaced with a newer model, I maintained perfect grades and worked part-time jobs despite our family's wealth. My mother noticed this imbalance and often advocated for me in private, but she was no match for my father's domineering personality. "Charlotte, you're so capable. You don't need the same support Tyler does," became my father's mantra whenever I questioned the disparity in attention, resources, or affection. The pattern was established early. My high school valedictorian speech was missed because Tyler had a minor league baseball game. My acceptance to Princeton went uncelebrated because Tyler needed tutoring for failing algebra. My mother brought me a small cake the next day, her eyes apologetic. "One day they'll see your worth, Charlotte," she whispered, squeezing my hand. She was my only ally in that house. We developed a special bond: morning coffee conversations before everyone woke, weekend museum trips when the boys attended sporting events, and quiet evenings discussing books my father deemed a waste of time. During these moments, Mom would share stories about her family's company, Morgan Pharmaceuticals, founded by her grandfather. "This will all be yours someday," she'd say. "You have the Morgan business instinct. Your father and Tyler," she would trail off, leaving the comparison unmade but understood. I didn't realize then how my father seethed at these moments of connection. He'd interrupt our conversations, suddenly needing Mom's attention for trivial matters. He'd schedule family events when he knew we had plans together. In retrospect, he was systematically trying to weaken our bond. When I graduated from Princeton with honors in business and biochemistry, my father managed to turn the conversation at dinner to Tyler's college prospects. Despite his abysmal GPA, my mother reached under the table to squeeze my hand in silent support. That night, I overheard their argument. "She's your daughter too, Richard," my mother hissed. "Would it kill you to acknowledge her achievements?" "Tyler is the future of this family," my father replied coldly. "Charlotte will marry and take someone else's name. The company will eventually need a Morgan man at the helm." "The company is mine to decide who runs it," my mother responded, a rare steel in her voice. The next morning, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a family schism that would eventually tear us apart, and how right my mother had been about who possessed the true Morgan business acumen. My life changed forever on a crisp autumn morning. I had just finished my MBA at Wharton and moved back to Connecticut to begin working at a biotech startup while maintaining close proximity to family. My phone rang during a morning meeting. Mom calling midday was unusual enough to excuse myself. "The doctor found something," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "I need you to come with me for more tests tomorrow." I canceled my meetings and drove straight home. When I arrived, I found my mother sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular. "Where's Dad? Does he know?" I asked, sitting beside her. He has a golf tournament with clients. I didn't want to bother him until we know more. The more we learned the next day was devastating. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had already metastasized to her liver. The oncologist spoke gently about comfort, care, and putting affairs in order. When we told my father and Tyler that evening, their reactions were markedly different. Tyler, now 19 and home from his first year at a state college, the only one that would accept him, broke down immediately. My father went completely silent, his face blank as he processed the information. "How long?" he finally asked, not looking at my mother but at the oncologist's card he'd placed on the table. 6 months, maybe less, I answered when Mom couldn't. That night, I stayed up researching experimental treatments, making lists of specialists, and organizing Mom's medical information. Dad locked himself in his study with a bottle of scotch. Over the next week, an insidious shift began. My father started working longer hours. He scheduled unnecessary business trips. His emotional absence was glaring. But Mom made excuses. "Hes processing in his own way, Charlotte. Some men can't face illness." Tyler followed our father's lead. He suddenly remembered summer commitments with friends, a part-time job opportunity too good to pass up. Their visits with Mom became shorter, less frequent, filled with awkward silences and glances at watches. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, I came home from picking up Mom's prescriptions to find her crying softly in her bedroom. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She tried to smile through her tears. "Your father thinks it would be better if I moved to the guest house. He says the medical equipment will disrupt the main house too much." The guest house was a comfortable 2-bedroom structure on our property, originally built for my maternal grandmother who passed before she could use it. But the symbolism was unmistakable. My father was literally removing my dying mother from the family home. "That's not happening," I stated flatly. "This is your house." But Mom, ever the peacekeeper, agreed to the move the next day. "It might be more peaceful for me there," she reasoned, though we both knew the truth. I resigned from my job the following week, using my savings to support myself while becoming Mom's full-time caregiver. My father hired a day nurse to help out, but I quickly discovered this was more for appearance's sake than actual assistance. The guest house became our sanctuary. We spent days looking through old photo albums, watching classic films, and having deeper conversations than ever before. Mom began telling me detailed information about the family business information I assumed she was also sharing with my father in their increasingly rare moments alone. One evening, about a month after the diagnosis, my father appeared at the guest house unexpectedly. He seemed agitated, pacing the small living room. "Grace, we need to discuss the business succession plan," he said without preamble. Mom glanced at me. "Charlotte should be part of this conversation. This is between us as majority shareholders," he replied coldly. I left them alone, but stood just outside the door, my heart pounding as I heard my father's voice grow increasingly insistent. "The board expects me to take over as CEO. It's the natural progression. Tyler can be groomed to step in eventually. Richard, Charlotte has the education and aptitude. Charlotte has no real experience. She quit her only corporate job to play nurse." I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. "To care for me when you wouldn't," she corrected, her voice stronger than I'd heard in weeks. When he left an hour later, I found Mom staring out the window, a strange expression on her face. "He wants control of the company," she said simply. "He always has." That night, she asked me to bring her a specific key from her jewelry box in the main house. It opened a safe deposit box at her bank. "There are documents you'll need," she explained. "But not yet. Promise me you'll wait until after I'm gone." I promised, not knowing this was the beginning of my mother's secret contingency plan, one that would change everything when my family's betrayal reached its peak. Over the next 2 months, my father and brother's visits became even rarer. Dad claimed the company demanded more of his attention now that Grace isn't there to handle her responsibilities. Tyler parroted similar excuses about school pressures, though his social media told a different story of parties and spring break plans. Mom declined rapidly. The once vibrant woman who had chaired charity galas and ran a boardroom withered before my eyes. The cancer was aggressive, but I suspected her broken heart accelerated the process. One particularly difficult night, as I adjusted her morphine pump, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. "They're not coming back, are they?" she whispered. I couldn't lie to her. "Not in the way we need them to." She nodded slowly. "I should have seen Richard's true nature years ago. The signs were always there." She drifted off to sleep before elaborating, but her moment of clarity was heartbreaking to witness. The next morning I called my father and demanded he visit. "I'm in Chicago until Thursday," he replied, ambient noise suggesting he was at a restaurant, not a business meeting. "Mom is asking for you," I pressed, swallowing my rage. "The doctors say it won't be much longer." His sigh was audible. "I'll see what I can do, Charlotte. This merger won't negotiate itself." When I called Tyler, he actually answered, which had become uncommon. "Dad says Mom's chosen this holistic route instead of proper treatment," he said, parroting our father's revisionist history. "He says there's nothing we can do now." "That's absolutely not true," I replied, stunned by the manipulation. "There was no treatment option, and you'd know that if you bothered to speak with her doctors or her. I can't handle seeing her like that," he whined. "It's too depressing." I hung up, seething with a rage I couldn't express in the quiet guest house where Mom was finally getting some rest. The ultimate betrayal came 3 days later. The hospice nurse arrived for her shift and handed me an envelope. "A courier delivered this to the main house," she explained. Inside was a formal letter from my father's attorney. He and Tyler were relocating to our vacation home in the Hamptons for the foreseeable future due to the emotional distress of the current situation. Enclosed was a check that was ostensibly for care expenses but felt more like a payoff. The letter closed by stating they would return for funeral arrangements when the time comes. They had officially abandoned us. I crumpled the letter, fighting back tears. When I composed myself, I called my father's cell phone repeatedly until he finally answered. "You're her husband," I said, my voice shaking. "You promised to love her in sickness and in health." "I can't watch this, Charlotte," he replied, his voice distant. "The company needs stability right now. I'll make sure all the expenses are covered." "This isn't about money. It's always about money," he said flatly before hanging up. That night, I slept in the chair next to Mom's bed, holding her increasingly frail hand. I didn't tell her they had officially left. Some truths were too cruel, even in our honest relationship. The next morning, Mom asked for her attorney. "It's time to finalize some things," she explained, her voice weak but determined. Benjamin Walsh had been the Morgan family's lawyer for decades. Unlike my father's cutthroat corporate attorney, Benjamin was thoughtful and kind. He arrived within the hour, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. "Could you give us some time, Charlotte?" he asked gently. I started to leave, but Mom called me back. "No, I want her to stay. She needs to understand what's happening." For the next hour, I witnessed my mother's extraordinary clarity and foresight as she made final adjustments to her will and signed a series of documents. Benjamin explained each one carefully, but much of the legal terminology was beyond my comprehension in my emotionally exhausted state. When they finished, Mom handed me an envelope. "Put this with the safe deposit box key. Don't open either until after." That night, her condition worsened dramatically. I called the hospice service, who sent a night nurse to assist. I also called my father and brother again, leaving messages that went unanswered. As dawn broke, I knew we were in the final hours. I held her hand, told her how much I loved her, and assured her I would be okay. "I know you will," she whispered, her eyes finding mine with startling lucidity. "You're stronger than all of us, Charlotte. Remember that when the time comes." Those were the last coherent words she spoke. My mother, Grace Morgan, passed away at 2:17 that afternoon. I was the only family member at her side. My father and brother returned the day before the funeral, tanned from their time in the Hamptons. They swept into the main house as if they'd never left. bringing with them a flurry of activity, calling funeral directors with last-minute changes, ordering different flowers, and inviting business associates my mother had barely known. I remained in the guest house, surrounded by the lingering presence of Mom, unable to stomach their sudden performance of grieving family members. Benjamin Walsh visited me there the evening before the funeral. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman," he said, sitting across from me at the small kitchen table, "and she was very concerned about what would happen after she was gone." "They abandoned her," I said flatly. "Now they're playing the devastated husband and son." Benjamin nodded sadly. "Your mother anticipated this. That's why she made certain arrangements." He hesitated. "I can't tell you more right now, but keep that envelope and key safe, and be prepared for your father to behave unpredictably in the coming weeks." The funeral was exactly as I had expected, a carefully orchestrated performance. My father, in an impeccably tailored black suit, received condolences with practiced solemnity. Tyler stood beside him, mimicking his composed grief. Business associates and social connections from my parents' world filled the funeral home, many of whom hadn't visited once during Mom's illness. I sat in the front row, physically separated from my father and brother, a tangible representation of the gulf between us. When it came time for eulogies, my father spoke eloquently about his beloved wife of 30 years and their beautiful partnership. I dug my nails into my palms to keep from screaming at the hypocrisy. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium on shaking legs. Looking out at the sea of faces, many familiar, most barely acquaintances, I abandoned my prepared remarks. "My mother died surrounded by love," I began, "but not by family. Not by those who should have been there." I saw my father stiffen. She faced her final journey with grace and courage, traits she demonstrated throughout her life. She taught me that family is defined by actions, not blood or surnames. I looked directly at my father. Some of us were paying attention to those lessons. Others were not. A murmur ran through the assembled mourners. My father's face darkened dangerously, while Tyler looked confusedly between us. After the service, as people gathered at our family home for the reception, my father cornered me in the kitchen. "That was completely inappropriate," he hissed. "You embarrassed this family in front of everyone who matters. You abandoned your dying wife." I replied, keeping my voice level. "You and Tyler left me to watch her suffer alone while you played golf and worked on your tans. There is nothing you can say to me about inappropriate behavior." His face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Benjamin Walsh appeared in the doorway. "Charlotte, could I speak with you privately?" he asked, his timing suspiciously perfect. In the study, Benjamin handed me a thick envelope. "Your mother wanted you to have this today. I've done as she asked and waited until after the service." I recognized Mom's handwriting immediately. My name was written in her elegant script across the front. "I'll give you privacy," Benjamin said, stepping out and closing the door behind him. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long, and a USB drive. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, I've left this world, and you are facing what comes next alone. First, let me say how deeply sorry I am that your father and brother weren't the men I hoped they would be. Their absence during my illness tells me everything about how they'll behave after I'm gone. What you don't know, what I've protected you from knowing, is that your father has been systematically embezzling from Morgan Pharmaceuticals for nearly 15 years. The evidence is on the enclosed drive and in the safe deposit box. Has stolen nearly $40 million, hidden in offshore accounts. I discovered this 6 months before my diagnosis, but was gathering evidence before confronting him. The company that has been in my family for 3 generations is now in jeopardy because of his greed. Your father expected to be named CEO upon my death, with the board none the wiser about his theft. But I've changed that narrative. Effective upon my death, you are the majority shareholder of Morgan Pharmaceuticals. The board has been quietly briefed about your father's activities, though they agreed to delay any action until after my passing. In 3 days, there will be an emergency board meeting where you will be appointed interim CEO. Your father doesn't know any of this yet. I know this burden is enormous, especially as you grieve. But you are the only person I trust to save our family legacy. You have always been the true Morgan in spirit and intelligence. The safe deposit box contains all the legal documents you'll need, as well as additional evidence of your father's crimes. Benjamin will guide you through the process. I'm so sorry to leave you with this fight, my darling girl. But I've seen your strength all your life, even when others overlooked it. Now they'll have no choice but to see it too, with all my love and faith in you. Mom, I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking so badly by the third reading that I could barely make out the words. My mother had known. She had planned. And she had trusted me with everything. As the reality sank in, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Looking out the study window at the gathering of mourners in our backyard, my father holding court as the grieving widower, I realized this was just the beginning. 3 days later, I would walk into the boardroom of Morgan Pharmaceuticals and change the course of our family forever. My father and brother had no idea what was coming. The 3 days following my mother's funeral passed in a strange limbo. I returned to the guest house, unable to bear the main house where my father and brother continued their performance of grief for visitors. When they thought no one was watching, they already began discussions about redecorating and moving forward. I spent those days reviewing the contents of the USB drive, meticulous documentation of my father's embezzlement scheme. Mom had hired a forensic accountant who tracked the money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. On the morning of the 3rd day, I dressed carefully, in a tailored black suit, one of my mother's, altered to fit me. I wore her modest pearl earrings and carried her leather portfolio. When I emerged from the guest house, my father was on the back patio, coffee in hand. Finally rejoining the land of the living, he asked, his tone suggesting my mourning was excessive. We need to discuss the house. Tyler wants to move back in, and there's no reason for you to stay on the property now. I have a meeting, I replied, walking past him to my car. With whom? He called after me, surprise evident in his voice. In his world, everyone important would be paying condolence calls to him. I didn't answer. The Morgan Pharmaceuticals headquarters occupied a modern glass building in downtown Hartford. I had visited occasionally as a child, accompanying my mother on weekend errands. The security guard recognized me immediately. Miss Morgan, they're expecting you in the main boardroom. The elevator ride to the top floor gave me precious moments to steady my breathing and focus my thoughts. The weight of what I was about to do pressed on me physically. This wasn't just about justice for my mother, or punishment for my father. It was about preserving a company that employed thousands and produced life-saving medications. The boardroom doors were imposing mahogany, bearing the company logo, a stylized M, intertwined with a caduceus. I paused before them, feeling my mother's presence strongly. I won't let you down, I whispered. 12 people sat around the massive boardroom table, most of them men in their 50s and 60s who had known my grandfather. Benjamin Walsh sat at one end, a position usually reserved for counsel. All conversations ceased when I entered. Charlotte. Walter Davidson, the board chairman and my mother's oldest friend, stood to greet me. Thank you for coming during this difficult time. I took the seat at the head of the table, my mother's seat. Before we begin, I said, my voice stronger than I expected, I want to thank you all for your discretion these past months. My mother valued each of you not just as business associates but as friends who helped build her family legacy. Nods around the table. A few murmured condolences. I've reviewed all the evidence. I continued, opening the portfolio containing printed copies of key documents from the USB drive, and I've accessed the safe deposit box containing the rest of the documentation. I understand you've all been briefed about the situation. Walter cleared his throat. Your mother came to me privately about 6 months before her diagnosis with suspicions about financial irregularities. We authorized a discreet investigation. He looked genuinely pained. None of us wanted to believe Richard capable of this level of betrayal. $43 million. I stated, the number still staggering to me. stolen over 15 years through falsified research allocations and inflated vendor contracts with kickbacks. The board has unanimously agreed to file criminal charges. Walter confirmed. The only question was timing. Your mother insisted we wait until after her passing. She wanted to protect you from the immediate fallout. And my father has no idea? I asked, already knowing the answer. None whatsoever, Benjamin replied. He expects to be appointed interim CEO at tomorrow's official board meeting. That meeting is still on the books, but this emergency session changes everything. For the next hour, we discussed the legal process, the PR strategy, and the company's future. By unanimous vote, I was appointed interim CEO, with a 6-month probationary period, after which my position would be re-evaluated. Your mother believed in you completely, Walter told me as the meeting concluded. She said you had the Morgan business instinct and the ethical compass the company needs right now. As I left the building, I felt simultaneously weightless and burdened. My phone showed 6 missed calls from my father. I ignored them and drove to the local police precinct where detectives from the Financial Crimes Division were waiting with Benjamin. 2 hours later, I returned home. A police car followed discreetly, parking down the street as arranged. My father was in his study when I arrived, pacing angrily. Tyler sat on the sofa, looking confused and sullen. "Where the hell have you been?" my father demanded. "I've been calling all day. We need to discuss the company situation before tomorrow's board meeting." "What company situation would that be?" I asked calmly, remaining standing though he gestured impatiently toward a chair. "The CEO position, obviously. There will be a transition period where I'll need to establish authority. The board respects me, but I'll need to show strong leadership immediately." I placed my mother's portfolio on his desk and opened it to reveal the forensic accountant's summary report. "You mean leadership like embezzling $43 million from your wife's family company?" "That kind of leadership." The color drained from his face as he scanned the document. Tyler stood up, moving toward the desk. "What's going on? Your father has been stealing from Mom's company for 15 years, I explained, not taking my eyes off my father. "She discovered it before she got sick and has spent the last year building an airtight case against him." "That's absurd," my father sputtered, but his eyes betrayed his panic. "These are complex financial transactions you couldn't possibly understand. The board understands them perfectly." I cut him off, "As do the police, the SEC, and the district attorney." "The police," Tyler echoed, looking between us with growing alarm. On cue, the doorbell rang. My father's face contorted with rage and fear. "What have you done?" he hissed. "I've protected my mother's legacy," I replied evenly. "Something you tried to steal along with her money." 2 detectives and a uniformed officer stood at the door. They had a warrant for Richard Morgan's arrest on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and financial crimes. As they read him his rights in our foyer, the same space where he had greeted funeral guests with manufactured grief just days earlier, I felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for what our family had become. "You can't do this," Tyler shouted at me as they led our father away. "Has all we have left?" "No, Tyler, we have the truth now, and I have a company to run." The look of shock on both their faces as the reality dawned on them that I, not my father, would be taking control of Morgan Pharmaceuticals was the first moment I felt my mother's presence since her death. I could almost hear her whisper, "Now they see." The weeks following my father's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. While he secured bail using his personal assets, the court specifically prohibited him from liquidating any property that might contain stolen funds. I immersed myself in learning every aspect of Morgan Pharmaceuticals. The company had been my mother's legacy, but I was determined to make it mine as well. I arrived at the office before dawn and left well after sunset, absorbing financial reports, research and development pipelines, and personnel files. I met with department heads, toured manufacturing facilities, and began building relationships with key employees who had respected my mother. Walter Davidson became an invaluable mentor, guiding me through the complex politics of the pharmaceutical industry. "Your mother had excellent instincts," he told me during a late-night strategy session. I see those same instincts in you. My father, meanwhile, had retreated to a luxury apartment downtown after being released on bail. He hired Preston Blackwell, the most aggressive defense attorney in the state, known for his scorched earth tactics. I was not surprised when the counterattacks began. The first salvo came in the form of a temporary restraining order seeking to block my appointment as CEO, claiming my mother had been mentally incompetent when making her final business arrangements due to her illness and medication. It's despicable, but predictable, Benjamin said when serving me with the papers. Hez claiming Grace was not of sound mind when she changed her will and the company's succession plan. She was more clear-headed than I've ever seen her. I replied, remembering my mother's focused determination during those final months. We have the medical records and her doctor's testimony to prove it. Charlotte has always been jealous of Dad's position in the company, he claimed in the article. Mom wanted the family to run Morgan Pharmaceuticals together, but Charlotte's hostile takeover has destroyed that dream. The lies were infuriating, but I refused to engage in a public family feud. Instead, I focused on stabilizing the company, meeting with nervous investors to reassure them about our strong financial position now that the embezzlement had been halted. 6 weeks after my father's arrest, I arrived at my office to find Melissa Winters, our head of HR, waiting anxiously outside my door. Charlotte, we have a situation, she said, following me inside. 3 of our senior research scientists have resigned simultaneously. They're going to Northwell Pharmaceuticals. Northwell was our biggest competitor, headed by James Northwell, my father's former roommate from business school and longtime golf buddy. Did they give any reason? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Better compensation packages, Melissa replied, looking uncomfortable. But the timing seems coordinated. I spent the morning calling each scientist personally. None would speak openly, but one finally admitted that my father had arranged the job offers through his Northwell connection, along with signing bonuses that we couldn't match. That night, I received a text from Tyler, ready to talk about a settlement yet? Dad says this is just the beginning. I deleted it without responding and called Walter instead. They're trying to sabotage the company, I explained. If those scientists had access to our research pipeline? They did, Walter confirmed grimly. We need to move quickly to protect our intellectual property. We implemented emergency protocols, changing security credentials and accelerating patent applications for our most promising research. I authorized retention bonuses for key personnel and personally met with our remaining research team to assure them of the company's stability. The most difficult blow came when I discovered Tyler had reached out to our mother's sister, Aunt Rebecca, who lived in Seattle and had been unable to attend the funeral due to her own health issues. He had apparently spent hours on the phone with her, spinning a narrative about me manipulating Mom and tearing the family apart. The email from my aunt was heartbreaking. I always thought you were so much like your mother, but Grace would never have destroyed her family this way. Please reconsider this vindictive path you've chosen. That night, alone in the guest house where I had cared for Mom, I still couldn't bring myself to move back into the main house. I experienced my first moment of true doubt. The weight of running the company while fighting my father's legal maneuvers and Tyler's PR campaign was crushing. The isolation was even worse. Former family friends had chosen sides, and many had aligned with my father and brother, unable to believe the charming Richard Morgan was capable of such deception. As I sat at the small kitchen table where Mom and I had shared our final conversations, I allowed myself to cry for the first time since her funeral. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered to the empty room. My phone rang, startling me. The caller ID showed Hannah Chen, Mom's former executive assistant who had retired a year before her diagnosis. Charlotte, I hope it's not too late to call. Her familiar voice came through. No, not at all, I replied, quickly composing myself. I've been following what's happening. I wanted to call sooner, but... She paused. Your mother and I were close. She confided in me when she first suspected your father's financial manipulations. You knew? I asked, surprised. Not the extent, but enough to be concerned. Grace made me promise not to say anything until she had gathered evidence. She was protecting the company, and you. Hannah's call was exactly what I needed, confirmation that I wasn't alone, that others had seen through my father's facade. Your mother believed in you completely, Hannah continued. She told me once that you were the only one who inherited her father's business acumen and her mother's integrity. Charlotte sees people as they are, not as she wants them to be, she said. After we hung up, I wiped my tears and pulled out the company files I'd brought home. Mom had seen people clearly, including my father. I needed to honor that clarity by refusing to second-guess myself now. The next morning, I called an emergency executive committee meeting. My father and brother are actively trying to destabilize the company. I announced without preamble, we need to stop playing defense and start anticipating their next moves. For the next 2 hours, we developed a comprehensive counter-strategy. We identified vulnerable employees who might be approached by my father, created contingency plans for potential client concerns, and allocated additional resources to protect our intellectual property. As the meeting concluded, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about family betrayal anymore, it was about protecting the livelihoods of thousands of employees and the patients who depended on our medications. Later that day, Walter pulled me aside. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. You're fighting exactly as she would have, not with public drama, but with strategic thinking and unwavering focus. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. That evening, I finally moved my belongings from the guest house to my mother's home office in the main house, the one room that had been truly hers, filled with family photos, art she had collected, and books she had loved. As I arranged my laptop on her desk, I noticed a small, carved wooden box I had never seen before. Inside was a handwritten note in my mother's elegant script, "For Charlotte, when the battle seems unwinnable." Beneath it lay her grandmother's diamond pendant, the Morgan family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. I fastened it around my neck, feeling its weight against my collarbone, a tangible reminder of the legacy I was fighting to preserve and the women who had come before me. The next morning, I walked into the office wearing the pendant, ready to face whatever came next. 3 months into my tenure as CEO, I had weathered the initial storm of my father and brother's attacks. The temporary restraining order had been dismissed, our key intellectual property was secure, and we had even managed to lure back one of the departed scientists with a compelling research opportunity. The criminal case against my father was proceeding, though his legal team had succeeded in delaying the trial through procedural maneuvers. In the meantime, his bail conditions prevented him from leaving the state or contacting company employees directly. I had settled into a rhythm at Morgan Pharmaceuticals, earning the respect of the executive team through consistent decision-making and transparent communication. The company's stock had stabilized after an initial dip following the scandal, and our third-quarter projections looked promising. What I didn't anticipate was the emergence of a third adversary, one who had been hiding in plain sight. The discovery came through Diane Walters, our newly promoted Chief Financial Officer, who had been meticulously reviewing all financial transactions from the past 5 years. "Charlotte, I've found something concerning," she said, placing a folder on my desk during our weekly meeting. "There's a pattern of consulting payments to a company called Artemis Ventures. The contracts look legitimate on the surface, but I can't find any deliverables or work product justifying the fees." I reviewed the documents, noting the payments had begun about 2 years earlier, well within the time frame of my father's embezzlement scheme, but using a different methodology. "What's the total?" I asked. "Just over $2 million, Diane replied. "Not nearly the scale of your father's embezzlement, but significant enough to warrant investigation. Do we know who owns Artemis Ventures? That's the concerning part. It's registered in Delaware with layers of shell companies. I've started the process of tracing ownership, but it's deliberately obscured. I authorized a discreet investigation, bringing in a different forensic accounting firm than the one my mother had used to investigate my father. I wanted fresh eyes on this new problem. A week later, I had my answer, and it felt like a physical blow. Artemis Ventures traced back to Carolyn Hamilton, my mother's best friend for over 20 years, and Morgan Pharmaceutical's chief marketing officer. Carolyn had been like an aunt to me growing up, attending every birthday party and school event, often showing up when my own father couldn't be bothered. She had appeared devastated at my mother's funeral and had been one of my strongest supporters during the transition. The evidence was irrefutable. Carolyn had created a dummy consulting company and approved fake contracts to funnel money out of Morgan Pharmaceuticals. But unlike my father's global scheme, her fraud had been concentrated and targeted and completely separate from his activities. She must have seen what your father was doing and decided to help herself, Walter suggested when I shared the findings with him privately. Perhaps she rationalized that if Richard was stealing millions, her smaller scheme wouldn't be noticed. I wasn't convinced. The timing seemed too coincidental, and Carolyn had always seemed genuinely loyal to my mother. Rather than immediately involving the board or legal team, I decided to confront Carolyn directly. I invited her to dinner at a small restaurant where my mother and I had often gone for private conversations. "This is lovely," Carolyn said as we were seated in a quiet corner booth. "Your mother and I used to meet here to discuss marketing strategies away from the office politics." "I know," I replied, studying her familiar face, the laugh lines around her eyes, the streak of gray in her dark hair that she had proudly refused to color. "Mom valued your friendship tremendously." Carolyn's smile faltered slightly at my use of past tense, "as I valued hers. And I value yours, Charlotte. You've done an amazing job these past months." I placed the Artemis Ventures folder on the table between us. "Then help me understand this, Carolyn." The color drained from her face as she recognized the company name on the folder. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "I can explain," she said quietly. "Please do. Because right now, it looks like you've stolen $2 million from my mother's company, from our family's legacy." Carolyn took a deep breath. It wasn't theft, it was protection. What she revealed over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my mother's final months. When Grace Morgan had first discovered Richard's embezzlement, she had confided in Carolyn immediately. Together, they had developed a strategy to gather evidence while keeping Richard unaware of their investigation. But my mother had feared that once confronted, Richard might attempt to drain company accounts or sabotage operations out of spite. "Your mother knew Richard's vindictiveness better than anyone," Carolyn explained. "She needed a contingency fund, money he couldn't access or freeze during what she anticipated would be a messy legal battle. The Artemis Ventures arrangement had been my mother's creation, a secret reserve of funds that could be used to protect the company if Richard tried to destroy it upon exposure. Carolyn had agreed to be the front person because my mother needed someone she trusted implicitly. After her diagnosis, Grace modified the plan." Carolyn continued. "She transferred ownership of Artemis to me with explicit instructions about how and when to use the funds." "Why didn't you tell me this after she died?" I asked, struggling to process this new information. "Your mother made me promise to wait. The instructions in her letter to you were deliberately incomplete. She wanted you to discover the rest on your own, to test your abilities to root out financial irregularities. She needed to know you could find hidden problems, not just the obvious ones your father created." "So this was some kind of test." I felt a surge of anger. "No, Charlotte. It was protection for you and for the company. Grace knew Richard would fight dirty once exposed. The Artemis funds were intended to counter any damage he might do." To prove her claim, Carolyn opened her purse and removed a sealed envelope. "I was instructed to give you this if you discovered Artemis. Not before." Inside was another letter from my mother, dated just weeks before her death, confirming everything Carolyn had told me. It detailed exactly how the funds should be used to counter any financial attacks by my father, to provide emergency capital if clients fled during the scandal, and to protect key employees from being poached. "There's more," Carolyn said. "Your mother suspected Richard had a hidden ally within the company, someone feeding him information even before she discovered the embezzlement." "Who?" I asked, though a sinking feeling told me I already knew. She was never certain, but she had suspicions about Daniel Harris. Daniel was our chief operations officer, appointed by my father 5 years earlier. He had been notably reserved since my appointment as CEO, though not openly hostile. "I need evidence," I said. Carolyn nodded. "Your mother thought you might. That's the other purpose of Artemis. Some of those funds went to a private investigator who has been monitoring communications between your father and several company executives. The reports are in a secure cloud storage account. I can give you access." As I drove home that night, my mind raced with implications. My mother had been playing a far more complex game than I had realized, laying groundwork for battles she knew would come after her death. She had created not just a defensive strategy against my father, but a network of allies and resources I could use when needed. The next day, I reviewed the private investigators' reports. They confirmed my mother's suspicions about Daniel Harris, documenting clandestine meetings with my father even after his arrest and communications with Tyler about company vulnerabilities. Rather than confronting Daniel immediately, I decided to use this knowledge strategically. Over the next 2 weeks, I began feeding him carefully crafted misinformation about our research priorities and financial planning information that I knew would make its way back to my father and brother. Meanwhile, Carolyn and I developed a true counteroffensive using the Artemis funds. We identified the clients my father was likely targeting through his Northwell connection and proactively strengthened those relationships with enhanced service agreements. We created a retention plan for valuable employees, focusing particularly on those who might be vulnerable to outside offers. Most importantly, we accelerated development of our most promising new drug, a treatment for a rare form of pediatric cancer that had shown exceptional results in early trials. This project had been my mother's personal passion, and completing it successfully would cement Morgan Pharmaceutical's reputation as an industry leader. 3 weeks after my dinner with Carolyn, the trap I had set for Daniel Harris sprung perfectly. My father and Tyler made a bold move exactly as I had anticipated, attempting to sow doubt among our investors about a fictional manufacturing problem with one of our key products. The information could only have come from Daniel, as it was part of the false data I had strategically shared. With irrefutable evidence of his disloyalty, I called Daniel into my office where Walter Davidson and our head of security were waiting. "I believe you've been sharing confidential company information with my father," I said without preamble. "We have evidence of your communications, including meetings at the Harbor Club after his arrest." Daniel's denial was half-hearted at best. When presented with the evidence, he quickly shifted to justification. "Richard built this company alongside your mother," he argued. "You've stolen his legacy with these fabricated embezzlement charges. The evidence of his crimes is overwhelming," Walter replied coldly. "And now you've implicated yourself as an accomplice." Daniel was escorted from the building that afternoon, his access revoked and his company devices confiscated. By evening, our legal team had filed for a restraining order, preventing him from contacting any Morgan Pharmaceuticals employees or clients. That night, I received simultaneous text messages from my father and Tyler. From Richard, "You think you've won something today. You have no idea what's coming." From Tyler, "Dad says to remind you that he knows where all the bodies are buried. Last chance to negotiate before things get really ugly." I forwarded both messages to Benjamin Walsh without responding directly. As I sat in my mother's office, now truly mine, I felt a strange sense of calm despite the threats. My mother had prepared me better than I had initially understood. She had created not just a legal strategy for after her death, but a comprehensive battle plan with resources and allies I could deploy as needed. For the first time since her diagnosis, I felt truly confident that I could preserve and build upon her legacy. My father and brother had underestimated me from birth, just as they had underestimated her throughout her life. That mistake would cost them everything. The 6-month mark of my leadership at Morgan Pharmaceuticals arrived with a board meeting to evaluate my performance as CEO. Despite my father and brother's systematic attempts to undermine the company, our financial indicators were strong. The pediatric cancer treatment, now named GraceMed in my mother's honor, had received fast-track approval from the FDA, generating positive press and investor enthusiasm. After unanimous board approval to remove my interim title, I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a growing unease. My father had been ominously quiet for nearly 2 weeks, no legal maneuvers, no Tyler-fronted media attacks, no attempts to poach employees or clients. Experience had taught me that Richard Morgan never retreated. He only regrouped before striking harder. My concerns were validated the following morning when Benjamin Walsh called me at home. "Charlotte, turn on Channel 8 News immediately," he said without greeting. I fumbled for the remote, unmuting the television to hear the tail end of a breaking news report. Allegations of corporate espionage against Morgan Pharmaceutical's CEO Charlotte Morgan. A spokesperson for the FBI confirmed they are reviewing the evidence provided by former CFO Richard Morgan. My phone began buzzing with text messages and email alerts as the story spread. By the time I arrived at the office, reporters had gathered outside the building. Walter Davidson was waiting in my office, his usually composed face tight with concern. "Your father has accused you of stealing proprietary information from Northwell Pharmaceuticals during your mother's illness and using it to fast-track GraceMed's development." "That's absurd," I replied, the accusation so unexpected I almost laughed. "I never had access to Northwell's research. Richard claims Grace obtained the information through corporate espionage and shared it with you. Hez provided emails supposedly exchanged between you and your mother discussing Northwell's research protocols." "They're fabricated," I said immediately. "Mom would never engage in corporate espionage, and neither would I." "Of course they're fabricated," Walter agreed. "But they're convincing forgeries. Richard has clearly been planning this for months." The implications were staggering. By accusing my mother, who could no longer defend herself, and me of corporate theft, my father had created the perfect revenge scenario. If the allegations gained traction, Morgan Pharmaceutical's reputation would be destroyed, GraceMed's approval could be revoked, and the company my mother had fought to protect would collapse. Most disturbingly, he had made my mother the central figure in this fabricated scandal, tarnishing her legacy as a final act of cruelty. Benjamin arrived an hour later, having reviewed the evidence my father had provided to the authorities. "It's sophisticated work," he admitted. "The emails appear authentic, with headers and routing information that would stand up to basic scrutiny. They've been backdated to when your mother was still actively running the company." "Can we prove they're fake?" I asked. "Eventually, yes. Forensic digital analysis should reveal inconsistencies. But that will take time during which the company's reputation and GraceMed's future hang in the balance." We assembled a crisis management team, including our head of legal compliance, PR director, and Carolyn. As we strategized our response, I tried to think as my mother would, not reactively, but several steps ahead. Hez using our playbook against us, I realized aloud. We gathered evidence quietly before exposing his embezzlement. Has been planning this counterattack since his arrest, creating a parallel narrative where he's the whistleblower and we're the criminals. "The timing is strategic," Carolyn added. "With GraceMed gaining attention, any hint of impropriety could derail the entire project. We need to find out how he created these forgeries," I said. "Someone with significant technical skills helped him." We initiated our own investigation, focusing on identifying the source of the fabricated emails. Meanwhile, we issued a carefully worded statement denying the allegations and pledging full cooperation with any investigation. 3 days later, we had our first breakthrough. Our IT security team discovered unusual access patterns to our email servers dating back several months. Someone had been using legitimate credentials to access archived communications between my mother and me. The credentials belonged to Melissa Parker in HR. Our head of IT security explained. But the access occurred at times when she wasn't in the office. When questioned, Melissa broke down immediately. She admitted that Tyler had convinced her to share her login credentials, claiming he needed access to personnel files to protect employees from Charlotte's vendetta against anyone loyal to Dad. "Tyler doesn't have the technical skills to create these forgeries," I pointed out. "Hez the front man, not the architect." The next piece fell into place when Benjamin received a call from an unexpected source, James Northwell himself, the CEO of our competitor and my father's longtime friend. He wants to meet with you privately, Benjamin reported. He says he has information about the allegations that he can only share in person. I agreed to the meeting, which was arranged at a neutral location with both our attorneys present. James Northwell, a silver-haired man in his 60s, who had known my father since college, looked uncomfortable as we sat across from each other. "I need to make something clear, Miss Morgan," he began formally. "Northwell Pharmaceuticals had nothing to do with these accusations. We compete aggressively but ethically." "Then why is my father claiming we stole your research?" I asked directly. Northwell sighed. "Because approximately 8 months ago, Northwell experienced a sophisticated cyber intrusion. Certain research protocols were accessed, specifically ones related to pediatric cancer treatments similar to your GraceMed project, and you think Morgan Pharmaceuticals was responsible. Initially, our security team thought so. The intrusion appeared to originate from IP addresses associated with your company." He paused. "However, our more thorough investigation revealed those connections were spoofed. We now believe the actual intrusion came from a third party." "Let me guess," I said, the pieces falling into place. "A third party hired by my father to make it look like my mother's company was stealing your research." Northwell nodded grimly. "Richard approached me 6 weeks ago, claiming to have evidence that Grace and you had orchestrated the intrusion. He asked for Northwell's support in pursuing criminal charges. But you didn't believe him," I noted. "I've known your father for 40 years, Charlotte. I've seen his capacity for creative accounting. And I knew Grace Morgan. She was ruthlessly competitive but unfailingly ethical." He slid a folder across the table. "These are our internal investigation findings, which contradict your father's claims. I'm providing them to you because I won't allow my company to be used in Richard's vendetta." The information from Northwell was crucial but not sufficient. We still needed to prove who had actually created the forged emails. Our investigation led us to a former IT contractor who had worked briefly at Morgan Pharmaceuticals during my mother's illness. Bank records showed large payments to him from an offshore account we had already linked to my father's embezzlement scheme. With this evidence, we approached the FBI directly, providing a comprehensive briefing on my father's history of financial crimes and his motive for fabricating evidence against my mother and me. 2 weeks later, as the truth began to emerge, I received an unexpected visitor at the office. Tyler arrived unannounced, looking disheveled and anxious, a stark contrast to his usual polished appearance. "I need to talk to you," he said when my assistant reluctantly showed him in. Privately, I dismissed my assistant but left the door open. "Say what you came to say, Tyler." My brother paced nervously. "Dad's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "He emptied his bank accounts yesterday and disappeared. His lawyer received formal notification that he's dismissing him as counsel." Tyler ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "He told me he was going to negotiate a better deal with the prosecutors. I thought he meant a plea bargain. But instead, he ran." I concluded, not entirely surprised. "He told me we were going to clear our family name," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "He promised we would get the company back and everything would return to normal." I studied my brother, still technically an adult at 25, but in many ways still the pampered teenager who had never faced consequences for his actions. "Tyler, nothing about what Dad did was normal or right. He stole from Mom's family company, abandoned her when she was dying, and then tried to destroy her reputation after death. He said, you and Mom were conspiring against him for years." Tyler insisted, but with less conviction than before. "And you believed him because it was easier than facing the truth." I shook my head. "Dad used you, just like he used Mom. The difference is she eventually saw through him. You still haven't." Tyler sank into a chair, suddenly looking very young. "What happens now?" "Now the FBI will issue an international warrant for Dad's arrest. The criminal case will proceed whether he's present or not, and you'll need to decide which side of history you want to be on." "What does that mean?" "It means you have a choice, Tyler. You can continue being Dad's puppet, or you can start making your own decisions." Morgan Pharmaceuticals will survive this because Mom built something stronger than Dad's greed could destroy. My brother stared at his hands for a long moment. I don't know how to do anything else, he finally admitted. Dad always told me what to do, what to say. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Tyler had been my father's project from birth, shaped and molded to be his ally and echo. Start by telling the truth, I suggested. Give a statement to the FBI about Dad's fabricated evidence and your role in accessing the company's email servers. Then, if you want a chance, a real chance to be part of this family legacy, you can come back with a different attitude. After Tyler left, I sat in silence, processing this unexpected turn. My father's flight was simultaneously an admission of guilt and his final attempt to escape accountability. I had no doubt he had been planning this contingency for months, hiding money beyond what we had already traced. The following weeks brought closure of a sort. The FBI formally cleared Morgan Pharmaceuticals and me of any wrongdoing in the alleged corporate espionage. Tyler, in a surprise move, provided a full statement acknowledging his role in my father's schemes. My father himself remained at large, though financial intelligence suggested he had fled to a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. The company stabilized as the truth emerged. GraceMed's development continued on schedule, with clinical trials showing even more promising results than initially projected. Walter Davidson announced his intention to retire the following year, publicly endorsing me as the long-term leadership for the company. 1 year after my mother's death, I stood in her garden behind the main house, the garden where she had first told me about her diagnosis. I had finally moved back into the family home, reclaiming the space that had briefly become my father's stage for performative grief. The company had not just survived, but thrived under my leadership. The legacy my mother had fought to protect was secure. And though my father had escaped legal punishment, he had lost everything that truly mattered: his reputation, his position, and his family. As the sun set over the garden my mother had lovingly tended for decades, I felt her presence more strongly than ever before. The journey had been more difficult and painful than either of us could have anticipated, but her faith in me had been justified. "We did it, Mom," I whispered to the gathering dusk. "We saved what matters." 5 years passed since I discovered my mother's letter and took control of Morgan Pharmaceuticals. Those years brought both professional success and personal growth as I navigated the aftermath of my family's implosion. My father remained a fugitive, reportedly living under an assumed name in a Southeast Asian country without extradition agreements with the United States. Occasional rumors of Richard Morgan sightings surfaced, but the man who had once commanded respect in Hartford business circles had effectively disappeared from our world. The criminal cases against him remained open, ensuring he could never safely return to American soil. Morgan Pharmaceuticals had not merely survived the scandal but emerged stronger. GraceMed, our pediatric cancer treatment named in my mother's honor, had exceeded all expectations in clinical trials and was now helping children around the world. The company had expanded into new research areas while maintaining the ethical standards my mother had established. My relationship with Tyler evolved in unexpected ways. After providing his statement to the FBI, my brother entered therapy and began the difficult process of separating his identity from our father's influence. Our reconciliation was neither quick nor complete, but it was genuine. Tyler enrolled in community college, eventually earning a business degree, and now managed a regional office of the Morgan Foundation, the charitable organization I had established with a portion of the recovered embezzlement funds. On the 5th anniversary of my mother's death, I visited her grave alone, bringing her favorite white roses. The simple granite headstone read, "Grace Elizabeth Morgan, beloved mother, visionary leader, enduring legacy." "I wish you could see it all, Mom," I said, arranging the flowers in the small bronze vase. "The company is stronger than ever. GraceMed has helped over 2,000 children, and Tyler, you'd be proud of his progress." That evening, I hosted a small dinner at the family home, no longer a house divided by secrets and resentments, but a place of cautious healing. Carolyn Hamilton, now retired but still a trusted advisor, joined us, along with Walter Davidson and Benjamin Walsh. Tyler arrived with his fiancée, Emma, a compassionate social worker who had been instrumental in his recovery. To Grace, Walter proposed a toast as we sat around the dining room table. Who saw clearly, planned meticulously, and loved fiercely. To Mom, Tyler and I echoed, our glasses meeting across the table. After dinner, I invited everyone into the library for coffee. As conversations flowed around me, I found myself by the bookshelf where my mother had kept her favorite volumes of poetry and philosophy. Running my fingers along the familiar spines, I noticed a slim leather journal I hadn't seen before, wedged between two larger books. Opening it, I immediately recognized my mother's handwriting. The first page was dated just days after her diagnosis. I've always believed that how we face death reveals the truth of how we've lived. Now that I'm confronting my own mortality, I'm determined to face it with the same principles that have guided my life: honesty, courage, and love for those who deserve it. Richard will show his true nature when tested. Of this I have no doubt. I've ignored the signs for too long, protecting Tyler from the truth, and hoping Charlotte would never need to know the full extent of her father's betrayal. That was a mistake born of pride and misplaced loyalty. Now, time is the one resource I cannot replenish. I must use what remains wisely, putting protections in place for Charlotte and the company, leaving breadcrumbs that will lead her to the truth after I'm gone. I believe in my daughter's strength more than she yet believes in herself. When Richard shows his true colors, as he inevitably will, Charlotte will find the resilience to stand against him. She has always seen people clearly, just as I eventually learned to do. My greatest regret is not having more time with her. My greatest comfort is knowing she will surpass me in every way that matters. Tears blurred my vision as I turned the pages, reading my mother's private thoughts during her final months, her strategic planning intertwined with reflections on her life and her hopes for mine. The journal continued until just days before her death, the handwriting becoming shakier but the thoughts no less clear. The final entry was the most difficult to read. I won't see the outcome of the plans I've set in motion. I won't witness Charlotte's triumph or Richard's downfall. But I know with absolute certainty that my daughter will preserve what matters, not just the company, but the values it represents. Richard believes he's the cleverest person in any room, which has always been his blind spot. He underestimates Charlotte as he underestimated me for years. That will be his undoing. I leave this world with unfinished business, but also with profound faith in my daughter's ability to finish it. Charlotte will heal what Richard has broken, perhaps not our family, which may be beyond repair, but certainly herself and the legacy we share. This is my final gift to her. The truth, painful as it is, and the opportunity to rise above it. I closed the journal, holding it against my heart as conversations continued around me. My mother's voice was so clear in those pages, strategic and loving, clear-eyed about my father's nature but never bitter. Tyler approached, coffee cup in hand. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I replied, carefully returning the journal to the shelf. "Just Mom, being Mom." Later, after our guests had departed and Tyler and Emma had left for their apartment downtown, I returned to the library and retrieved the journal. I read it cover to cover again, drawing strength and perspective from my mother's words. In the years since her death, I had focused primarily on professional success, rebuilding the company, developing GraceMed, establishing the foundation. Personal healing had taken a back seat to these more measurable achievements. My mother's journal reminded me that true legacy isn't measured solely in business accomplishments or even charitable works, but in the lives we touch and the values we uphold. She had fought to preserve the company not just as a business entity, but as an expression of the principles she believed in. The next morning, I made two significant decisions. First, I established the Grace Morgan Mentorship Program, designed to support young women entering the pharmaceutical industry with scholarships and professional guidance. Second, I began writing my own journal, not just recording business strategies and accomplishments, but exploring my feelings about the family trauma I had experienced and the healing journey still ahead. 6 months later, I received an unexpected email from Aunt Rebecca. my mother's sister who had been misled by Tyler during the height of the conflict. She had finally learned the full truth about my father's crimes and wanted to reconnect. Our cautious correspondence blossomed into regular video calls, gradually rebuilding the family bond that had been severed. On one such call, Aunt Rebecca shared stories about my mother's childhood that I had never heard, tales of a young Grace standing up to bullies, organizing her first business venture, selling handmade jewelry at 12, and defying her own father's expectations by attending business school when he thought she should focus on finding a husband. "Your mother always knew her own mind," Rebecca said, smiling at the memories. "You remind me so much of her, not just in appearance, but in that core of steel beneath the polite exterior." "I'm learning that's a compliment," I replied. "Though I didn't always see it that way. Grace would be proud of how you've handled everything," my aunt continued. "Not just saving the company, but finding a way forward without letting bitterness consume you. That's the true victory." Those words stayed with me in the months that followed, as Morgan Pharmaceuticals continued to grow and evolve under my leadership. We launched new research initiatives focused on rare diseases, established additional community health programs, and expanded international access to our medications. 2 years later, 7 years after my mother's passing, I stood at a podium accepting the Healthcare Leadership Award for our work developing treatments for underserved patient populations. This award honors innovation and ethical leadership in pharmaceutical development. I began my acceptance speech. Those values were instilled in me by my mother, Grace Morgan, who built our company on the belief that business success and human compassion are not competing priorities but complementary forces. Looking out at the audience, I spotted Tyler and Emma with their newborn daughter, Grace Elizabeth, named for our mother. Carolyn sat beside them, now a doting honorary grandmother. Walter Davidson, though retired, had attended to show his support. 7 years ago, I learned through painful experience that family can be defined in many ways. Blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty or love. Sometimes family is found in the people who stand beside you during your darkest moments, who believe in your strength when you doubt yourself, who hold you accountable to your highest values. I touched the diamond pendant at my throat, my mother's family heirloom that I now wore daily. Morgan Pharmaceuticals isn't just a company to me. It's a living legacy of the woman who taught me that integrity is not negotiable, that true strength comes from vulnerability, and that the measure of our lives is how we respond when tested. My mother faced her greatest test with courage and foresight. She protected what mattered, not wealth or status, but purpose and principle. Those are the values that guide our company today and will continue to guide us into the future. As applause filled the room, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that began with my mother's secret letter had transformed not just the company, but me as well. The pain of betrayal had not disappeared entirely. Such wounds never fully heal, but it had been transformed into something constructive and meaningful. My father had stolen much from us, but he had failed to take what truly mattered. The moral compass that guided both my mother's life and now mine, the resilience that turned tragedy into purpose, and the capacity to build something lasting from the ashes of betrayal. As I left the stage, I silently thanked my mother once again, not just for the practical preparations she had made before her death, but for the example she had set in life. She had shown me that our response to betrayal defines us more than the betrayal itself, that healing comes through purposeful action rather than passive resentment, and that the most powerful legacy we leave is not financial but ethical. In saving my mother's company, I had found my own path forward. In honoring her memory, I had created a future she would have been proud to see. If you've ever experienced family betrayal or had to rebuild after a major loss, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. How did you find strength when it seemed impossible? What lessons did you learn along the way? Please like this video if my story touched you in some way. Subscribe for more real-life journeys of resilience and transformation, and share with someone who might need to hear that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayal. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Remember that our greatest strength often emerges from our most painful moments, and that's something no one can take from you.